start recording. Oh, okay. Cool.
Easy.
It's recording.
Yes.
Okay.
Give it a few minutes and then we'll start up.
Yeah. And I think Sarah is our next intro.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Amari. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sarah, and myself and Sean Ho are co-leads for the Policy Nerd Nights team. We are a newly formed coalition of policy nerds who organize monthly panel discussions and educational webinars like this one on all things U.S. policy. We are thrilled to have collaborated with RepresentUS San Diego and Bay Area on tonight's panel discussion about the largest anti-corruption bill our nation has seen in a long time. And we're more than honored to be sharing the stage with some incredibly accomplished and fascinating panelists.
I really need to start off by expressing gratitude at having a chance to work with this great team. I'm genuinely excited to help organize a nuanced, educational, and hopefully entertaining evening of fact-based civil discourse. Amari, what is our actual goal here tonight?
So our main goal here is to dive into the details of the For the People Act, also known as HR 1, which is already passed in the House of Representatives. For tonight's policy panel, we will focus on providing a factual, nuanced, expert-led conversation to try to understand what this 800-page legislation actually does. We hope that every viewer is able to walk away with a much more comprehensive understanding of the legislation as a whole. While we recognize we cannot cover every detail of HR 1, the panel will address the effect on our democracy, discuss its merit and its constitutionality, and try to give some background as to why this game-changing legislation is so important. So Gabe, do you want to go into the structure of this evening?
Sure. First, if you've been following this legislation, a similar version was first introduced in 2019. Since then, HR 1 has been widely discussed, dramatized, and oftentimes demonized, where cable news pundits and journalists have continued to editorialize the conversation, oversimplify it, and pack it in a way that neatly fits into some agenda. In creating this event, we recognize that we need to do better. We're breaking our discussion up into three segments. First will be voting access and redistricting. Second will be campaign finance. And third will be ethics and security. We will begin each segment by offering a brief overview of the expansive legislation before we turn the conversation over to our expert panel, where they can provide the nuance and real-world implications of the bill. The Zoom Q&A is open, but the chat is closed. Please send any questions through the Q&A with your name and where you're from, and we will get them to our panel of experts. Sarah?
All right. On that note, we are so excited to finally introduce our panel of experts for the evening who were generous enough to offer their time for us tonight. These professionals work on the front lines daily in the battle against corruption in U.S. politics. They work to expand voting access, reform campaign finance, and to ultimately ensure that politicians are held accountable to their bosses, we the people. So without further ado, let's meet our panel. Gabriel?
Okay, first, will our panelists please turn on their cameras and I will stop sharing. Okay. There you go. So as our moderator this evening, Dan Schnur will be keeping the conversation going as we work through our policy segments. Dan is a professor at UC Berkeley, Pepperdine, and USC in the respective institutes of government studies, the Grad School of Public Policy, and the Annenberg School of Communications. Dan also hosts a weekly town hall webinar for the LA World Affairs Council called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan has worked on 4 presidential campaigns and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, including as the Director of Communications to late Senator John McCain's 2000 presidential run. Dan has since worked on groundbreaking campaign finance disclosure requirements and co-chaired a bipartisan reform effort in California to lay the foundation for their landmark Independent Redistricting Commission. He is a registered independent, no party preference voter. Welcome, Dan, and can you please tell us why you are passionate about corruption reform efforts?
Well, sure. First, of course I will. First of all, Gabe, I want to thank you for that very kind introduction. It might not have sounded like all that much to many of you, but my students at Berkeley handed in their final papers at the end of the semester today. So Gabe, you are the first person under the age of 40 to say something nice about me all week long, and I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for it. I also want to thank Gabe and Amari and their entire team at Represent, and want to thank Sarah and Sean and the entire group at Policy Nerd Nights for the tremendous work that they are doing, not just in putting on tonight's program, but all day, every day, in advocating for meaningful campaign reform. That's how change gets made. And I can't tell you how impressed all of us are by the work that you and your colleagues are doing. So thank you so much. Why do I care about fighting corruption, Gabe? Well, because I have students at my schools who are the fourth and fifth generations in their family to attend the universities they go to. I have students in my classes who are not only the first in their families to go to college, but the first in their families to graduate from high school. And I believe that that young person, regardless of her or his civic goals and interest in community and political engagement, deserves just as much right and just as much opportunity to make a real change. And the only way to do that is to level the playing field for them. So every one of them gets that opportunity when they decide it's their time to step up, the way you and your colleagues have.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. It's an honor to have you moderating, and thank you again for being here. So our next panelist for the evening is Cindy Black. Cindy Black is the Executive Director of Fixed Democracy First. As a leader, Cindy has made it her goal to ensure that the government works for the will of the people, not for the power of money. Cindy was campaign director for the successful Washington I-735 ballot initiative that called for a constitutional amendment in campaign finance to end court decisions like Citizens United. After the campaign, Cindy expanded her team to lead on other paramount issues, such as increasing voting access and creating alternative voting systems such as ranked choice voting, or RCV. Welcome, Cindy, and thank you for your commitment to building coalitions to helping to pass common sense, pro-democratic with a small d, legislation reforms on both local and national levels. So again, welcome, Cindy, and can you please tell us a little bit about why you are passionate about the fight against corruption?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I want to thank Policy Nerd Nights and RepresentUS San Diego and the Bay Area for putting this together. I think it's really important that we have discussions like this. For me personally, I got involved with this because I really saw the influence of big money in our system and felt that we really needed to do something about it. I actually have two grandchildren that I said, you know, I don't want them growing up in a system where they don't really have a say and, you know, big moneyed interests have taken over. So I actually used to sell art supplies before I took on this job and decided that, you know, this was much more valuable use of my time. And so I'm dedicating pretty much the rest of my working life to working on these issues and hopefully moving our democracy, like you said, with a small d forward.
Wow, thank you so much. Next up is Trevor Potter. Trevor Potter is the founder and president of the Nonpartisan Campaign Legal Center. Campaign Legal Center seeks a future in which the political process is accessible to all Americans, resulting in a representative, responsive, and accountable government. Trevor Potter is a former Republican chairman of the Federal Election Commission and was general counsel to John McCain's 2000 and 2008 presidential campaigns. To many, he is perhaps best known for his recurring appearances on the Colbert Report as the lawyer who helped Stephen Colbert set up his super PAC during the 2012 election. The American Bar Association Journal has described Potter as hands down one of the top lawyers in the country on the delicate intersection of politics, law, and money. Potter has recently appeared on CBS's 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper, on CBS's Face the Nation, and on NBC Nightly News, and the films Dark Money in 2018 and The King in 2017. His writing has been featured in publications such as The Washington Post and The Hill. And as a special shout out to our savvy RepresentUS viewers, we could also thank Trevor for being one of the main architects in crafting the American Anti-Corruption Act that we really hold dear to our fight against corruption. Welcome, Trevor, and can you please share what drives you to do this fantastic work in corruption reform?
Thank you, Gabe, very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all, to see Professor Schnur again after a while, and to work with RepresentUS, which I've had the pleasure of doing for a number of years. I am always a little nervous when people make a Colbert reference, so I have to remind you of what it was that his staffer said to me just before she shoved me through the curtain for my first time on the set with Stephen. She leaned over and she whispered in my ear, "Just remember, he's the funny one." So I warn you that most of what I have to say does not rise to the level of Colbert humor, but just as he focused on money in politics and the dangers of corruption and the possibility that large and particularly secret money would buy legislative results and overpower the voices of average Americans, so I worry about it, and I have since I was at the Federal Election Commission and since founding CLC now about 20 years ago, worked on the McCain-Feingold reform law, and then through CLC on advising on HR1 S1, the big reform bill we're going to talk about tonight, and we're trying to figure out how to get that through the Senate, because we think it really will make a difference in making elections more open, fair, transparent, and ensuring that average Americans do in fact have their voices heard in Washington.
Well, thank you so much, and we're very happy to have you. Our next panelist is Mark Gaber, and he is the Director of Litigation at the Campaign Legal Center, often referred to as CLC. He has worked on a number of redistricting and voting rights cases and has represented the CLC as amici counsel before the Supreme Court. Those cases in particular challenged racial gerrymandering in Virginia and North Carolina. Mark has also served as co-counsel with the CLC, challenging Alabama's felon disenfranchisement laws, as well as having argued a 10th Circuit appeal in a case involving the redistricting of Albuquerque's city council districts. He's obtained multiple bars in numerous circuits in the United States Court of Appeals and the US Supreme Court. Welcome to our conversation, Mark.
Thank you. And as for why I'm interested in this, I come from the state of Wisconsin, which, always had sort of well, it was always court appointed, but as a result of that bipartisan districting maps for most of my life until 2010, in which probably one of the worst gerrymanders in American history was put in place, and has resulted in the inability of the voters to access elected office for their chosen officials, and has skewed policy in the state of Wisconsin, and has made it so that the politicians are choosing the voters rather than the other way around. And so I was drawn to CLC in particular for its work in that case to try to fight partisan gerrymandering. And though the Supreme Court saw otherwise, our work continues, and HR1 would do a lot towards solving that problem.
Okay, thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, that's our panel, and we will go ahead and kick off and start this show. So let me go ahead and share my screen real fast. Okay, so we'll jump into HR1 Explains and the voting access and redistricting. Not many things in our democracy are as sacrosanct as the right to vote. The baseline acceptable criteria is that all eligible citizens should have the constitutional right to cast their ballot. This gives voters a voice, and they should have the right to choose their representation instead of representatives choosing their voters. This gives voters their power. HR1 creates a system where there's a clear set of minimum requirements for each state to meet, and many of the provisions have bipartisan origins at both the state and federal levels. Here are some quick ways that HR 1 is changing the game to unrig our political system. And this will be brief, but HR 1's modernization of our current voting registration system is really aimed at making the system safe, secure, easily accessible, and more accurate. Things like automatic voter registration, already implemented in 16 red and blue states, can save money and ensure accuracy, where agencies that we know and trust will participate in voter registration. Think places like the DMV. Same-day registration, which has already been implemented in 21 states, red and blue, will become the standard. Vote by mail, popular with voters and already implemented in 29 states. Again, red and blue will become the norm, and best practices will be used to ensure that it is done safely and securely. The list goes on and on. Interstate cross-checks, consistent early voting access, election integrity audits, paper ballots, reaffirming voter rolls. These are all intended to increase security and expand access. And that doesn't even get into the gerrymandering conversation, where politicians are able to choose their voters. This is wrong for any party. Our moderator, Dan, has worked gerrymandering reform in California. Mark has argued in front of the Supreme Court. So you guys are the experts. Please take it away.
Okay. Well, Gabe, thank you very much. And I think that overview was just the scene setter we needed before we dig in to a deeper conversation with our expert panel. And for those of you who might be a little bit newer to this conversation, I will tell you that Cindy and Mark and Trevor are three of the nation's leading experts on these issues. We're lucky to have them with us today. I know that Sarah and Amari wanted us to go through the bill page by page, all 800 pages. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to pull that off into a 90-minute segment. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay, is ask each of you a few questions. And as Gabe mentioned earlier, we're dividing the bill into three segments. Number one, voting access and redistricting. Number two, campaign finance. And number three, ethics and security. And still leaving time at the end for questions from our audience and our participants. So let's go through these segments one by one and ask each of you to help us understand this very complicated bill in a way that allows us to become better advocates for important reform. And Cindy, I'm going to start with you, not so much with a question about the bill, but rather a question about the concept. Look, we're a 50-state country, and each one of our states is extraordinarily unique with different challenges, different opportunities, different demographic and ideological makeups. A lot of smart people would argue that each state is uniquely well-positioned to decide for itself what type of voting standards ought to exist. So I guess the first question I'd ask, even before we dig into the details of the bill, is why is it so important to have a national set of standards for states to follow rather than letting them make these decisions for themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because why do we want more uniform standards for all the states? I think one of the biggest reasons is access to the ballot and making it easier for people to be able to vote, and that we all have the freedom to vote as Americans, and we should have a more consistent way to do that. In Washington State, for example, we've had automatic voter registration and same-day registration. We've been a mail-in, vote-by-mail state for a dozen years or more, and we've really found that it doesn't benefit either party. It makes it simple, and that's what I think this bill does. It tries to simplify the process across all the 50 states. And so we all have a consistent way to vote, regardless of where you live or who you are, what color you are, your demographic, your background. Any of those things shouldn't matter. We should all just have consistency and make it remove any barriers to voting. Especially, I think what we've really seen is there are some states that are putting forth a lot of different bills right now that actually would create more barriers. And the bill for the People Act would actually make it consistent, and it would make it easier for people to be able to vote, simplify the process, so we all have the same access to voting. It doesn't benefit one party or the other. We've seen that in Washington. Voting by mail doesn't benefit one party or the other. It just makes it consistent, makes it convenient for voters, and simplifies the process. So I think this is just a good overall way to modernize the election. And I think it's really long overdue that we do this.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Certainly, there's no there's no shortage of policy matters that are best handled at the state and local level. But I think you make a really important point why a federal standard is so important. I have many of the questions I'd like to ask you, Cindy, but I want to bring Mark and Trevor into the conversation first. And so, Mark, we're really lucky to have you here. I have to say, I didn't realize that you were a fellow cheesehead. And so we'll have to talk a little bit later about the Aaron Rodgers controversy. But before we get to that, more important things. One of the ongoing debates as it relates to voting access is what seems to be a never-ending argument between the two parties about the importance of voter access versus voter fraud. And let's agree that both are important. Providing access to those who deserve it is critical to the functioning of our democracy, but so is preventing those who are not eligible from participating. How does this legislation address both of those concerns?
Well, it has a lot of provisions that deal with both. We saw in the 2020 election some of the best, highest voter participation in our history. And one of the reasons for that, kind of counterintuitively, was the pandemic, that a lot of states that had very restrictive mail-in voting rules eased some of those to allow folks to vote by mail. And you saw near uniform appreciation for that from the voters. And so what this bill does in part is ensure that there is that type of no excuse universal mail-in voting available to voters across all of the states, stopping some legislation that's in place now to restrict that, and overriding some state statutes that otherwise would do that. It solves some problems that voters face. In Pennsylvania, for example, there was a statute that required a ballot to be received by election day. Well, voters don't control the mail, and so they have no way of knowing whether the ballot they've mailed, say 5 days before the election, will actually be received by that day. So this sets a standard that the postmark has to be by election day, which is sort of a uniform standard that everyone can comply with. It requires same-day voter registration, which helps to alleviate some of the voter purge issues that voters have faced in states across the country for the past decade in particular, and in particular following a bad Supreme Court decision out of the state of Ohio a few years ago that applied a sort of use it or lose it rule for voting, and that should not be the metric against which someone is judged able to vote. So there's a lot of voter protections in here. They're balanced with voter security measures, and it's not just the kind of the red herring of in person personifying someone else who's not, you're saying you're not who they are, but it actually gets to voter security issues. So there's measures to prevent hacking of voter rolls. There's funding for kind of white hat hackers to make sure that the systems are secure and encouraging them to be checked. There are still requirements if you're a first-time voter and you are registering by mail or online. You have to provide, if it's online, you have to provide your handwritten signature. So there can be proper signature matching in states that do that. And you still have to provide some form of federal ID or a utility bill if you're a first-time registrant by mail. So it maintains those sorts of security measures that I think everyone agrees are important, but it ensures access. And it's that balance that this bill seems to get right and avoid some of the kind of false narratives that have driven a lot of the conversation before this.
Well, Mark, that is very, very helpful. And what I'm going to do is I'd like to stick with you for just a minute and partially switch the subject, because this first segment is on both voting access and redistricting. And I must admit that redistricting is a particularly important hobby horse for me. It was the very first issue I worked on in the California governor's office many, many years ago. And what I came to believe then is that letting politicians draw their own districts is like letting teenagers set their own curfews. So that even if everybody starts the evening with the best and most noble of intentions, when the hour gets late, self-interest takes over and bad things happen. So I'm wondering if you could, before we go deeper into this conversation, talk about how this bill improves the redistricting process, particularly because both sides in different states around the country have engineered such egregious gerrymandered districts to work in their own party's favor.
Right. And, I mentioned Wisconsin when I started. That was the Republican drawn plan. We see the Democrats do it whenever they have the chance. They just had fewer chances in 2010. But Maryland is an example of a state where CLC has argued that Republican voters are harmed. And so what HR 1 does is requires, at least for congressional elections, for an independent redistricting commission to be set up in each of the states. And to have that commission be a group of citizens who are both Republicans, Democrats, independents, to draw the line. So you're taking it away from the politicians, giving it to regular citizens, and then also setting forth a series of criteria that will guide the decision making. And so one of those criteria that's critically important that's added by HR 1 is to have partisan fairness in the drawing of the plan. So there's different metrics by which that can be judged. There's all sorts of political science literature on it, but essentially it's ensuring that when viewed from a statewide basis, one party or the other is not having an unfair number of seats that they naturally without the gerrymandering would receive. It also ensures, of course, compliance with the Voting Rights Act, ensuring that minority voters have an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice, and ensures that various other communities of interest are not split up. Oftentimes they're split up now, in search of the best partisan outcome for a particular party in power. And so this sort of doubly gets rid of that by putting it in the hands of independent citizens, and then also making sure that there's uniform criteria across the country that apply. And it also has some good provisions that, in the absence of if a state just chooses to ignore this requirement and not have an IRC, or if the Independent Redistricting Commission is for some reason unable to come up with a plan, there's a uniform court procedure. And so these types of cases would go to a 3-judge panel in the District of Columbia. And that's good because these are really complicated lawsuits when they happen. And so it's good to build up a sort of reservoir of expertise in the federal judiciary and ensure that they are approaching it as well from a uniform standard. So this really does, again, at least with respect to congressional elections, resolve the problem of partisan influence and gerrymandering.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that overview. And I couldn't agree with you more. For those of you who are not based here in California, we were able to pass the type of redistricting reform into law here of the type that Mark is talking about at the statewide level. What I would tell you is that in the 10 years before redistricting reform passed, about 10 years ago now, there were 5 statewide elections in California, of course, over those 10 years. With 53 congressional districts, that means, if you do the math, that means there were 265 campaigns for the US House of Representatives over that decade. And over that 10 years, the party in control was reelected to that seat 264 of the 265 times. And since that, the Redistricting Commission has come into, the Citizens Commission has come into being, not every district is competitive. You can't find enough conservatives in Berkeley or enough liberals in Bakersfield to create a truly balanced district. But it has created a level of competition and restored a voice to the citizens that hadn't existed for many previous years. Trevor Potter, first of all, it's so good to see you again. We worked together 21 years ago on Senator McCain's campaign. And what impressed me so much then, and has still impressed me as I followed your career with admiration over the years, is more than, well, many things. But most of all, the way you're able to maintain an idealism about how the system ought to work with the realism about how to navigate that system. And I know what an invaluable resource you were to Senator McCain during his fight for campaign finance reform back in the day. And what I'm going to ask you now is to employ that same combination of idealism and realism. We're going through this bill, as you know, section by section. And in this segment, on voting access and redistricting, I'd ask you to help us understand what the path forward is like for the bill. Are there problems? Are there gaps? Are there fixes needed in this bill in order to make it work the way it's intended to? What do you see for its path forward?
Well, let me start with a question that I think was also raised in the chat, and that is, it's passed the House on a party line vote. It is now before the Senate. The Senate Rules Committee is going to take it up. With a 50-50 Senate, each committee has equal membership. And so what will probably happen is it will come out of the committee to the floor on a deadlock vote in committee. And then what does happen on the floor? Yes, the Democrats in theory have 51 votes, with the vice president voting to break a tie. But as everyone knows, a minority of the Senate is able to stop Senate action on legislation simply by what's called filibustering, saying they object to the bill and they don't want it brought up to the floor, and they can prevent a vote. So the reality is that there need to be Republican votes for this in order to pass it, or the filibuster has to in some way change form, and that would require all 50 Democratic senators and the vice president to vote to change the Senate rules. And so far, it does not look as if there are 50 Democratic senators who want to change the rules. And Senator Manchin of West Virginia has been very direct and reasonably vociferous about saying he doesn't want to change the filibuster, particularly for something like voting reform, which has become a very polarized issue in Congress and he says in the country. So what's the path forward? One of them is that over time, Senator Manchin changes his mind and there are 50 votes in the Senate to have an exception to the filibuster or to at least modify the way it's conducted so that there actually has to be a debate that goes forward and votes occurring. So we don't know whether that's a possibility. There is speculation that there could be some sort of a bipartisan deal here that 10 or more Republicans would support. And I read a number of newspaper columns that say that's what ought to happen and the Democrats ought to get on with it. Of course, the problem is you can't do that without 10 or more Republicans willing to support it. And so far, the Republicans there are not 10 who have come forward and indicated they want to do that. I'm sure there are private conversations going on behind the scenes. And it is certainly possible that if there is no way to pass the whole bill, that there would then be a way to pass important parts of it. So that goes to the two other questions I think that you've asked, Dan. One is, are there problems with the bill itself? Are there constitutional issues? And here I think it's worth just stepping back and looking at the fact that although we have a generally decentralized election system and states control the way elections are run, unless there is federal law, there has been quite a bit of federal law on elections. Congress has set the date of the election. Congress, through the Voting Rights Act, has prohibited poll taxes and literacy taxes, and those have applied to all federal elections. Actually, all elections in the case of the poll and the literacy taxes. So there is precedent. The reason there is that the Constitution itself, in the original document before any amendments, said that the states could set the rules except when Congress intervened, and that Congress is specifically given the right to set the time, place, and manner of federal elections. And that means that Congress has broad latitude, if it wants to, as Cindy was explaining, to set national minimum standards. They wouldn't be telling states how to run everything, but they would be saying you have to give voters certain opportunities to vote regardless of what state they're in, because we think being able to vote on a weekend or being able to vote by mail-in ballot is important, and that we want to encourage people to vote, and therefore that's the minimum. If states want to do more to open up elections and do all mail-in as Washington and other states have done, or experiment, that's fine, but there's certain basic minimums to ensure that American citizens can vote in federal elections. So there's a constitutional basis for that exercise of congressional authority. And while it's a big bill, there are lots of pieces. Each one has been carefully looked at and discussed over time. As you may know, Dan, the bill itself is a compilation of a lot of bills that were introduced before in Congress, many with bipartisan sponsorship. So the FEC reforms is a bill that was there before. The disclosure reforms are there in the Disclose Act. The redistricting reforms have been discussed before, ethics, all of that. So there has been a lot of attention to making sure that it is drafted to withstand constitutional challenge. And of course, you know, we're Americans. We have a God-given right, we think, to sue. Anyone can go to court, and I'm sure there'll be lots of lawsuits. But I think it's pretty well drafted. Though I'll close by saying that the one piece that is not in this, it's important for people to realize, is rewriting the portion of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, that was declared unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court. And just briefly, in the Shelby County case a couple years ago, the court said, yes, Congress has the power to say that there are some states that have a bad record of voting rights and allowing minorities to vote, and therefore they have to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department before changing their voting rules, which is what Section 5 required. But the court said, we don't think Congress actually paid enough attention to this. The states listed in the act and the most recent authorization at that stage had been there for almost 40 years. And they said Congress really didn't do its job and make sure that the states were correctly identified, and states that didn't need it were removed. So Congress needs to go back. They need to do it again. It's in H.R. 4, which is a different bill, the John L. Lewis bill in the House. It will move to the Senate. And one of the speculated compromises is that that gets incorporated with portions of H.R. 1 in a Senate compromise. But that's the one thing that is coming. Congress could pass it on its own as it's written, or it could add it to a bigger bill like S1.
Well, thank you very, very much, Trevor, both for the overview of the bill itself, but also of its prospects for moving forward. I'm going to shift to our second segment on campaign finance now, but I'd like to stick with you, Trevor. And what I'd like to do in particular is stick with the question of constitutionality, because the central question, as you know probably better than anyone in the country, as it relates to campaign finance reform, is the First Amendment related question, is money free speech? When it relates to expressing my political opinion, is my ability to spend money on behalf of my cause, my issues, or my candidate the functional equivalent of free speech? The Berkeley versus Vallejo Supreme Court case back in the 1970s indicates that it is, but it's a much more complicated conversation than that. And I'm wondering if you could help us navigate what seems like a really simple question, but isn't. Is money speech?
So the court didn't say money is speech. What the court said is slightly more complicated, of course, as courts tend to be. What they said was that sometimes money is necessary in order to speak. You could stand on a street corner without spending a penny and speak, and the people around you would hear you. But if you bought a bullhorn to be heard by more people, you would have spent money. So the court says that although speech exists, the ability to magnify it and be heard by more people may well require money. And the court says sometimes that money can be regulated, and because the government has a good reason preventing corruption, and other times it can't be regulated because there's no possibility of corruption, or back in Berkeley, in some cases, no evidence of corruption. So that's the distinction. And the way the court drew that line is to say, yes, you can say to John Q. billionaire, you may not give a $10 million check to your favorite candidate because that has the potential to corrupt. By giving them that money, they're going to be indebted to you. They're going to worry that you won't give it to them next time, and unless you do what they're asking you to when you get to Congress. So they said, okay, you can limit money in terms of what you give to candidates. But they said, if you are John Q. billionaire and you want to run yourself for office and you want to give yourself $10 million in your campaign account, who are you corrupting? You can't corrupt yourself, was their reasoning. So they said you can't limit what a candidate spends on their own campaign. And then they went a step further and said, and you can't limit what John Q. billionaire spends to urge the election of someone else if it's totally independent of that other candidate. If they don't talk to the candidate or coordinate with the candidate, but they just go out. That's a little trickier. I think we've discovered is wrong. But what they said was, if you go out and do it on your own and you don't coordinate at all, there is less likelihood of corruption because you might say something that's unhelpful to the candidate. And you're expressing your own personal views. And so that's core First Amendment speech. And we don't think it corrupts. There's no evidence it corrupts. So we're going to say that if you make a truly independent expenditure as an individual, then you can go ahead and do that without limit. So that's the line they drew. Sometimes money is speech. Sometimes that money can be limited. Other times it can't. And that's the minefield we've been walking through ever since Berkeley for the last, I guess it's, what would it be now? About 40 years, not quite. And that's one of the issues that came up again in the famous Citizens United case in 2010.
Well, as a longtime communications specialist, I've spent most of my career having really smart lawyers tell me it's not as simple as I thought it was. So thank you for adding to that legacy. But it does seem to me, Trevor, that let's use your analogy of giving a speech on the street corner. I go stand on the street corner, I go stand on the town square, and I give a speech about something important to me. I'm exercising my First Amendment rights. But if while you're giving a speech in the town square, I pull up next to you in a sound truck and I download immense speakers on both sides of you, crank them up to 10 and drown out every word you're saying, I'm not just expressing my right to free speech, I'm interfering with yours. And it seems to me that that's the premise for smart campaign finance reform. As the president said the other night, not every right is absolute. And do I have a legal leg to stand on with that argument?
Yeah, I think certainly in the example you give, you do, because you have literally drowned out my speech. So you have prevented me from speaking, and that in itself would be a problem. The question that you face in the campaign finance area is, are you actually preventing other people from speaking, or are they just not being heard because, well, and that does happen. I mean, there are instances where huge super PACs go out, compete with each other, and buy up all the television time, particularly in small states. It just goes. So not only can the auto dealers not get on and advertise their sales, but the other candidates, other political speakers literally can't speak on television because there's no airtime left or on radio. So this money race does present exactly the scenario you're talking about in some instances. It's also, though, corrupt. It has led to corruption. And that's where the court was wrong in Berkeley. They said back then, there's no evidence that independent speech can corrupt. And what we've learned since then is two important things. First, it's almost never independent in the way the court meant. And remember, the court said because it's going to be totally independent, they might say the wrong thing and it wouldn't help the candidate. Nobody says the wrong thing anymore. They hire the same political consulting firms. The candidates are really clear about what they want to have said. They even put out on the internet what they call B-roll, which is film of themselves, so that it can be used by the so-called independent spenders in their ads. So it isn't in any way truly independent of the candidates. These super PACs are all run by people close to the candidates. Every presidential campaign has their own independent super PAC, which the candidate proudly announces on television, and it's headed by somebody who used to work for the candidate, and the money is raised by somebody close to the candidate, and the candidate is allowed by the Federal Election Commission to go to a super PAC event and thank the donors who gave to this totally independent PAC. So it's not independent, which was the precondition of the court saying it wouldn't corrupt and therefore could be unlimited. And that's made, I think, has totally changed what the court was thinking. And if they knew that back then, they would not have ruled the way they did. And so I hope that at some point, a new Supreme Court is going to say, wait a minute, the reality is this is corrupting because it's not independent.
Okay, so in the meantime, before that next Supreme Court takes up that challenge, Trevor, you've done, as always, an extraordinary job of laying out the challenge we face. Cindy, I want to come back to you to bring the conversation back to the legislation that we were asked to discuss. Trevor has very articulately and very helpfully explained the challenge of campaign spending, the potential for corruption. But HR 1 contains a proposal for at least a potential solution to that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what democracy dollars are, how HR 1 would address them, and a little bit more broadly about the concept of public financing, if you would.
Sure. So public funding of elections is one of my favorite ways to deal with campaign finance issues. So in the bill for the People Act, they have what's called the My Voice Voucher Pilot Program that is mirrored off of something similar that we've done in Seattle, which is the Seattle Democracy Voucher Program. So basically, this opens up the door for vouchers to be eligible for people that are running for congressional office. They've had public funding for presidential candidates in the past, but this one in particular would be for congressional offices. And it would be for open it up for 3 different states. The FEC, the Federal Election Commission, would pick 3 states to pilot this program off of the Seattle program. And so how the Seattle program works, it started in 2017. We have odd year elections in Seattle. So we're in the 3rd cycle right now. And in Seattle, what happens is every eligible resident of Seattle gets 4 $25 vouchers that they can give to the candidate of their choice that's participating in the program. So it's a voluntary program. You don't have to participate in it. Candidates can choose to participate. Same with the piece, the pilot program would do that. So participating candidates can get money from everyday citizens and not to rely on big money or special interests to do that. It opens up the door to not just citizens to be able to participate more in the elections and be able to donate without coming up with their own money, because this would be paid for not with tax dollars, but by a fund that would be coming from fines and fees for different, violations. In particular from corporations and possibly, wealthy donors. So this would open up the door for candidates to be able to run for office that maybe could never afford to run otherwise. And then it also enables citizens to participate and donate money to candidates by using the vouchers. And what we've seen with the Seattle program is that it's opened up the door to allow people that normally wouldn't donate to the campaigns to be able to participate, especially lower income folks, women, people of color, young people. We've seen a huge increase in the Seattle elections in using the voucher program that enables a lot more participation than it used to. It's just expanded the donor base, and we've seen many different diverse candidates being able to run that could never run before and actually winning by using the democracy voucher program here in Seattle. And I was excited to see this in the bill because I think it's a great way, another option for public funding of elections, other than other traditional ways like matching funds. You mentioned public funding, other things in the bill. There is also a matching fund program also for congressional candidates in there. It would be up to a 6-to-1. So if a candidate got, say, $100 donation, that would be multiplied, so they'd end up getting a 6-to-1, so they'd end up getting like $700 instead of just that $100 with this. Again, it would open up the door for more people to run for office. What we know about elections right now is big money tends to rule. And also special interests are very interested. Trevor talked about, independent expenditures. We didn't talk about PACs, but that's a big part of it. Political action committees, especially the super PAC, similar to what Trevor helped create for Stephen Colbert, basically gives unlimited money that gets funneled through, and it's often done by special interests shoveling money into the campaign. So we see this public funding program, the voucher program, and the matching program in the bill that would just really even the playing field a little bit more, allow everyday citizens to participate in the election, allow more of a diverse slate of candidates to run for office and win without depending on the big money donations that we're seeing right now. Because what right now is the candidates with the most money tend to win most elections. And we're hoping, and we're seeing that change in Seattle, for example, with the voucher program. We're seeing candidates that have the voucher program, they're able to interact. And that's the other thing I like about the voucher program is that candidates actually have to interact with the residents of Seattle. They just don't have a fundraiser with a handful of big donors showing up. What they actually have to do is go out and talk to the people and ask them, this is my issue. These are the issues that I'm fighting for. Would you contribute? And everybody has a say. They can hand out their $25 vouchers to all of them, all 4 of them to one candidate, or they can split it up among the candidates. But we're just seeing it's more interactive with the constituents. And we're seeing big success with this. We really are. I'm excited to see the public funding pieces in the bill, and I'm hoping that this is one of the areas that goes through.
Cindy, I actually have 1,000 follow-up questions for you on that, and I don't think we're going to be able to get to them all. But I also want to bring Mark back into this conversation because, Mark, look, money in politics is one of the most visible and one of the most divisive issues in the entire political reform debate. And so it's not surprising it gets a disproportionate amount of attention in the discussion over this bill. But it seems to me there's another aspect of this bill that's gotten almost no attention, which is critically important. And that's the makeup of the Federal Election Commission. And these are the 6 individuals who, at least theoretically, are entrusted with overseeing the fair process of elections and democracy in our society. And we don't have time to talk about all the ways it's not working the way it's supposed to. But maybe you can help us understand a little bit about why their role is so important and what this bill can do to make it to allow the commission to play a more meaningful role as was intended.
Well, you put your finger on the problem when you said the word 6. So if you've ever tried to come to a decision and a majority rules and you have 6 people, you see wherein the problem is. And so this was, perhaps a good idea. It was the commission is set up now is that there's, you can't have more than 3 members from the same party. So it's a bipartisan commission. The idea at the time was you don't want the Republican commissioners only enforcing against the Democratic candidates, and you don't want the Democratic candidates trying to enforce the law only against the Republicans. So let's kumbaya, everyone together. We'll only enforce the law against the violators of the law.
And how has that worked?
Well, it worked for a while. I mean, it worked. Trevor can attest. He was on the commission at a time when there was enforcement or more enforcement of laws. But what has happened, unfortunately, is Senator McConnell in particular has devised a strategy whereby the commissioners that he supports not only, they don't, it's not that they want to enforce the laws against the Democrats, they don't want to enforce the laws at all against anyone. And so, and this is not only an enforcement problem, but the FEC is a rulemaking body. And so some of the problems we see with dark money and the lack of disclosure come from the inability to pass rulemaking surrounding disclosure requirements. And so what HR 1 does is it ends the 6-member body and makes it a 5-member body. And so that's one key reform. You can actually, get a majority vote. There's no more deadlocks. And the other aspect that's really important is it empowers the Office of the General Counsel. So the FEC has there's 3 commissioners, but it's a much bigger agency. There's lots of staff and attorneys and really dedicated, smart folks. And what happens now is they conduct a sort of preliminary determination when there's a complaint filed as to whether there should be further investigation. It's called a decision as to whether there's a reason to believe a violation occurred. And then it goes to the commission right now. And what often happens, or what maybe usually happens, is that's the end of it. The 3 commissioners say, yeah, there's clearly reason to believe here. And 3 say, no, we don't see that, even though the facts and the law are pretty clear. And so what happens under HR 1 is the recommendation of the General Counsel's office controls at this stage and launch an investigation unless a majority of the 5 commissioners vote otherwise. And so it empowers the staff to, without the political influence, to actually conduct some investigation, and then the commission will have the opportunity to determine whether there's probable cause that there's been a violation of law. And so this will do wonders both for actually enforcing the law and doing it in somewhat of a timely manner, and in allowing for reasonable regulations where necessary to add more, understanding and heft to the statutes to make their way through. And this provision I've heard be attacked on the lines that it's putting a partisan group in control. The party, whoever the president is, their party can control the commission. But it maintains the requirement that there be only 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans and 1 person who's neither. And frankly, it would be better to have, even if there's a president, and even if that president decides I'm going to appoint people who don't believe in campaign finance law, at least sometimes there would be enforcement of our campaign finance laws. And I don't think the problem has ever been commissioners enforcing the law against people from the other party. The problem really that we have is the lack of any enforcement whatsoever. And so this is one of the most important provisions, I think, in the bill.
I couldn't agree with you more in several important fixes. But the first and simplest one, I will tell you, I chaired for a time, I was the chair of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. And we have 5 commissioners and had many 3-2 votes. But at least there was a resolution at the end of the discussion. And you're right, they weren't always party line votes, but when they were, it allowed a resolution to exist. So one of many fixes, but I think certainly a especially necessary one. We're going to move on to our third segment now, and ask Gabe to come back, if he would, and talk to us about why this third segment on ethics and security is so important. And then we'll go back to our panelists to dig in a little bit deeper and hear their analysis on this aspect of the bill.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. I think I should be back up and running in 2 seconds. All right. So a conflict of interest is an official action or decision taken in a particular manner that benefits a politician, his or her friends or family, and is a way of a politician benefiting or profiting off of their position. We, the people, have a stake in ensuring that our government acts on our behalf. They literally need to represent us. HR 1 does make some changes here. And just to give a baseline understanding of a few things, and I'll toss it back. HR 1 creates an improved system of ethics reforms, conflict of interest reforms, and accountability for our federally elected officials. This extends to the 3 government branches, their cabinet, and even goes into the ethics of transition teams and their political appointees. HR 1 works to reform ethics in political fundraising, lobbying, outside compensation, and even recusal where appropriate. In addition, HR 1 handles the ethics of advertising by prohibiting things like deep fake videos, strengthening advertising oversight, and even notifying states of disinformation campaigns. The ethical behavior of our federally elected officials should start from the campaign and extend through their service to our country and our people. The wide-ranging topic likely touches many other notes from this evening. So I will go ahead and give it back to you and help, Dan, can you help us understand some of the implications of the ethics reforms and let us know how things are interconnected back to voting access or back to campaign finance. So.
Well, thank you, Gabe. And let this be my first effort at lobbying both you and your colleagues and Sarah and Sean and their team about the need to do a follow-up program, because it's pretty clear as we sit 2/3 of the way through the program that we're not going to be able to cover these topics in nearly as much depth as each one deserves. So I'm going to pick out one aspect of this segment of the bill, and I'm going to ask Trevor, if he's willing, to talk a little bit about the presence and the impact of foreign money in elections. Again, I'm going to oversimplify, Trevor, but I thought that foreign money wasn't allowed in elections. Why is it in our elections, and how does this bill stop it?
It's not allowed, of course. Persons who are not U.S. citizens may not spend money in U.S. elections, either giving it to candidates or making independent expenditures under the law. So there are 2 ways that this happens. One is by hiding the sources of the money, putting it through some sort of a LLC, a money laundering operation where there are a chain of different accounts. And when the money eventually turns up, it doesn't look like a ruble or other foreign currency. Now that happens, we have a really recent example of that, which is the 2 Ukrainian Americans who ended up being associated with Giuliani and arrested. And this week, of course, there were more developments in that involving searches of former Mayor Giuliani's offices. But those Ukrainian Americans are indicted for having funneled foreign money through corporations that they controlled and then into the independent Trump super PAC. And they gave enough money and promised enough money that they got a dinner from that independent PAC with President Trump at the Trump Hotel in Washington, where they lobbied him to fire the US ambassador to Ukraine, which of course he did. So there you have a great example of foreign money from sources still unknown in terms of who the original foreign sources were. We just know it came through foreign corporations and into US corporations and into a US PAC. That is dealt with in this bill by the transparency provisions, the disclosure provisions that would mean we wouldn't have this dark money coming in because you'd have to disclose the sources of it. And those individuals were in fact then investigated by the FBI and, as I say, indicted. So if there is foreign money and it is possible to have transparency, to see how it is flowing, then that can be stopped. The other way foreign money came in, again in the last 2016 election, we now know through all the investigations and the testimony, was through purchasing of internet advertising. And that's really a different problem because the money isn't going directly to a candidate, it's going to expenditures from the social media corporations. Now, what those corporations, some of them have done since then is say, all right, we're going to stop accepting rubles, which they literally did in 2016. We're going to stop accepting rubles. It has to be dollars. You have to tell us who you are. We have to have some proof that you're an American. Well, that may be fine for Facebook, which has adopted that policy. But as we all know, the internet is huge. There are lots of places out there. There are lots of organizations out there. And so a Russian group or a Chinese or an Iranian will just go somewhere else and run their advertising if they can't do it on Facebook, and they'll still reach people. They can target them. So what is in HR1 S1 is something that has been a freestanding bill called the Honest Ads Act. And I will say, tooting our horn for a moment, that Campaign Legal Center not only was the group that filed the FEC complaints that led to the discovery of the Ukrainian money, but we are the group whose lawyers worked with the congressional sponsors in drafting the bipartisan Honest Ads Act. And what that act does, which is now in HR1, is to require that ads run on social media meet the same standards that they do if they're run on radio or television. And remember that our disclaimer ads, the things at the bottom that say paid for by, and give the name of the entity or the committee, those were passed in the 1970s when no one had even thought of the internet. So they don't cover the internet, and Congress has never gone back and required the same sort of disclaimers. So that's what the Honest Ads Act would do. It would first require the disclaimers and the sources, and then it does something else that I think is really important in today's social media world, which is if you take out a radio or TV ad or even a newspaper ad, it is possible for me and the press and others to see what's in that ad. The stations keep copies of it. Newspapers have copies of their papers available, or you can find them online. But if I go out and I purchase targeted social media advertising, the only people who see that are the people who I have paid to view it. It is not publicly available. It isn't broadcast to the whole world. And so I could run an ad saying terrible things about you, Dan, and run it in targeted neighborhoods. And they'd call up maybe if someone knew you and say, Dan, I just saw this awful thing about you. You say, well, what did it say? Where can I see it? It's not there. It only went to those people. It is not publicly available. And so what the bill does is say that there has to be a public archive of advertising run on social media and who it was targeted to in general, so that there is a way to know what is being said in public paid communications, as there is again in radio and TV and differently in newspapers. And I think that really makes a difference, because one of the things we see so much written about is the micro-targeting, where misinformation and falsehoods are targeted to particular groups of people, and nobody else knows that's being said, even though it's a paid communication in a campaign setting.
Okay, so Cindy, first of all, I'm struggling with the fact that my friend Trevor Potter is going to run negative ads against me. And so, but once I get past that, what I hear from his overview is just how extraordinarily complicated this process is. And you know, there's a saying for those who would argue against campaign finance reform. They say, money is like water. It's always going to find a way through the cracks. And I wonder, as I hear Trevor talk about the intricacies of the sheer inventiveness that those who want to get around our current rules have identified, I guess the question I have for you is a little bit broader. Does this type of reform, does disclosure, does recusal, do these concepts, do they really help to fight corruption? Or are those who are truly interested in being corrupt, are they going to find a way no matter what we do?
Yeah, I really do think the types of reforms that are in this bill, HR 1S1, really do help fight corruption. When we look at ethics reform, accountability, and transparency, they are just important tools in fighting corruption. Good government requires effective ethical leadership. We need to establish guidelines, parameters for behavior from the people that represent us. If we don't, it leaves a lot of room for people to engage in unethical behavior and creates a corrupt system. Don't we want a system that people can trust? I mean, that's what it comes down to. Transparency allows for things like detection and reduces the likelihood of corrupt behavior because it lowers the information barrier, allows for scrutiny and monitoring. It also deters corruption by increasing the chance of getting caught. Keeping people in the dark creates more opportunity for corruption to take place in the first place. If we don't know it's happening, how can we hold people accountable? I also believe that transparency facilitates public involvement by giving them the opportunity for citizens to influence government spending, policies, decision-making. If the public knows what's going on, they have more information and influence on how and what is being done in government. I think that's one reason why a lot of people don't trust government, because we don't know what's going on. And then in regards to recusal, withdrawal on the grounds of a conflict of interest or lack of impartiality, that's another important component to fighting corruption in government. We shouldn't have judges, for example, hearing cases where they have some political or personal interest to gain. How can you really be impartial under that scenario when you have something that you're going to get out of the situation or the outcome? I really think it dilutes the public confidence in the system, and it opens the door to possible corruption, or at least the appearance of corruption. And I hear that from people all the time, is that they feel government is corrupt. And I think having these type of boundaries, because we're talking about boundaries here, about how people operate in government, can actually restore a whole lot of trust in our government and cut back on corruption in a big way.
Cindy, thank you very much. I do find that encouraging. But Mark, I'm gonna turn to you for more encouragement, because I do agree with Cindy. I always like to say that politics is too important to be left to the politicians. It takes reformers like those that represent us and at the Nerds Night to get involved and stay involved. But it does seem like the very devious people who are just as smart, okay, almost as smart as you and Cindy and Trevor, are going to find a way around these rules as soon as they're implemented. Talk to us about how we can continue to protect ourselves and make sure that the reform and the disclosure really can help to fight corruption, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I've often found in our work that you feel sometimes like it's a game of whack-a-mole, and that's the case, not only in the campaign finance and ethics side that we're talking about right now, but in the particularly in the voting and in the redistricting side we talked about earlier. But the fact that that is the case doesn't mean that you stop whacking the moles. You have to go after them, and you have to close loopholes as they arise, and you have to fight to ensure that you are covering the latest devious scheme that's coming up. And HR1 does that both by solving some of these loopholes that we've talked about, that Trevor has pointed out, but also with the structural reforms that we talked about earlier, that it actually, some of the problem here is not the laws, but the inability to enforce those laws. And so we, together with the closing of the loopholes and with the enforcement mechanisms, I really do think that you'll see an improvement. And the point that Cindy made at the end, the appearance of corruption, is really almost, in many cases, as important as fighting actual corruption. And that's because the system of democracy that we have, that's built on people's faith that it works and that they are actually giving the consent, to be governed. And that depends upon the trust and the appearance that the system is working. And so I think having these kinds of guardrails, even if a new loophole is found, a new devious scheme is made, we can handle that then. But there are enough of them right now that we need to ensure that there's trust in the system.
Well, that does make me feel better. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Trevor. What I'd like to do what I can, and we are going to try to work in a couple of your audience questions because there have been some phenomenal ones that have come in over the course of this program. But my next question is actually for our hosts. And so, Sarah, if I can put this next question to you. We have a lot of really motivated people who've been listening to this incredible presentation from our panelists. I can tell by the kind of questions they're asking, they want to do something. So I guess my question for you, Sarah, from them is how can we help fight unethical behavior and politicians profiting off of their position? What's our role in this?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think that there are 1.5 million things that we as individuals could do day by day to curb unethical behavior. But let me just take a moment to talk about the fundamentals. So I would say that there's like a 3-pronged approach that we as individuals could take to curb unethical behavior. Number one, first and foremost, is education. It becomes exponentially easier to lobby your members of Congress, your local representatives, and to advocate for legislation when you actually know what that legislation entails. And that's a huge core fundamental value to Policy Nerd Nights, hence these monthly US policy deep dives. And 2 is to know and use your tools. I myself didn't even understand until recently that there is so much publicly accessible information about the US political system that we can all access. For example, all of our members of Congresses and elected officials' voting records, all of their campaign contributions, that's all publicly available online. So know how to use those tools. Go to opensecrets.org, go to your member of Congress's website, understand who they're taking money from, etc., and hold them accountable that way. And thirdly, and possibly most importantly, there has to be kind of a cultural shift. Up until very recently, politics was absolutely taboo to talk about with your friends or even your family around the dinner table. And as my co-lead Sean says, the taboo of talking about politics allows unethical behavior to perpetuate. So if we're not able to comfortably talk about the nitty-gritty details of US politics, this stuff will continue to be brushed under the rug. So there has to be a cultural shift in a sense. And I'll pass it over to Gabe.
Okay, and Gabe, I'm going to reframe the question just a little bit from where Sarah took it on, because I think from a broader cultural standpoint, Sarah, you make all the sense in the world. I see how many more of my students will spend hours and hours and hours every week volunteering their time in their community, but not taking 15 minutes every 2 years to vote, and trying to explain to them that volunteering isn't just admirable, that's noble, but it's not a substitute for voting. The two need to go hand in hand. I think I couldn't agree with you more. Gabe, what I hope you'd be willing to address, both on your own and on behalf of Represent, is specifically as it relates to HR 1. How can those of us who feel strongly about its passage, what can we do to make a difference and help increase the likelihood of its support?
I really appreciate the question, Dan, and that was a fantastic answer, Sarah. Just, I fully agree with you. Education is definitely paramount, and we have to get them set up. But really, what my response is going to be: get involved, find a coalition. So obviously, I'm here tonight representing Represent San Diego and Represent Us, and I will, speak for Amari over at Represent Bay Area for a second, and join us, represent us, work with us. Let's make a difference. We are doing phone banks, text banks. There's advocacy at all kinds of different levels that we can get involved in, and we are really trying to set up events like this, and also get on the phone, talk to people, other voters in other places, whether it's texting them and making sure that they're coming to events like this, or they're going out and calling their senators, so that their senators know that people are really, making sure to understand that their people want these reforms. So that's really, I think, paramount, is getting involved, join a coalition, join us. If you're in San Diego, you can find us. If you're in California, you can find us and Represent Us National. RepresentUS.org, or excuse me, RepresentUS is definitely a great place to go and find a coalition similar to ours all across the nation. The other thing I would say, and I will give a quick shout out to Trevor, Mark, and Cindy, is join a group like theirs. Fix Democracy First is doing fantastic work. The Campaign Legal Center, they're also doing fantastic work. Look us up. We will give you some information at the end of this, and you can find us, but get involved, find a way, ask questions, educate yourself, but then also take that next step. Call us, find us. We can find ways to get help, whether it's social media or on the phone or anything else. We always have ways to use active and willing, volunteers.
Well, that was immensely helpful. Thank you, Gabe, and thank you, Sarah. And once again, thanks to all of your colleagues at Policy Nerd Nights and at Represent, because you really do amazing work. We have several questions, and I want to thank Sarah's colleague, Sean, for the phenomenal job he's done in trafficking these questions for me. Sean, I think you'd agree that every single one of these questions could be a 90-minute panel on itself. So if I do the math right, that means we'll be here until lunch tomorrow. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to only pick out a couple of them. First one, and I'm going to start with you, Trevor. I don't know the answer to this, and I figure if anyone does, you would. The question is the following. Has any lawsuit been brought on the point of voter access that actually someone living in one state, for example, Georgia, has less access to the ballot than a person in, say, Washington state, which seems a breach of constitutional guaranteed equality? Has that ever been tested in court?
It's a great question. I do not believe it has. The equal protection claims are often brought, but in either against a state law, saying that, for instance, that law discriminates against minorities and therefore privileges other groups and makes it harder for minorities to vote, or saying that the way the law has been constructed, say prohibiting, which Texas does, most people from casting a mail-in ballot, injures Texans. But I don't know, what I'm hearing is a question of, could someone in Texas say it's easier to vote in California than in Texas, and therefore I am injured and my rights aren't equal. Now, HR 1 would, of course, as I've said, establish a basic national standard of equality for voting rights. But I don't know that I've seen a suit like that, unless Mark has. Mark would be our other great litigator here, but I'm not aware of any.
It's certainly an interesting theory, particularly for the election for president, where everyone is voting for the same office. I suspect part of the reason we haven't seen a claim like this is because of the central role that states are given in the Constitution in setting the rules for elections. And so while the Equal Protection Clause is in the Constitution, so is that authority. And that's likely why. But as Trevor said, that's why it's so important that Congress exercises its power to ensure that equality.
The next question could be for any one of the three panelists. And I'll warn you in advance, it's a totally unfair question, but it's a fascinating one. Cindy, I see you rubbing your hands together in anticipation. So here's the question from Vicky. If we could roll back time and HR 1 had been in place before the 2020 election, what, if anything, would have been different? And I don't mean to be picking on Cindy. Any one of the three of you, feel free, please, to take your best shot at that.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. I think some things would change, but like we mentioned before, I forget, I think it was Trevor or Mark had mentioned that we had one of the best voter turnouts in the 2020 election because a lot of those barriers to voting by mail and things like that, longer polling times, extended voting, there are just more options for people. And what would happen, I think, if we had those standards in there, I don't necessarily think we would have seen the lawsuits we saw from the former president challenging the election. I'm guessing that might have been a possibility. I don't know for sure, but that could have definitely helped. Let's just say that.
I think Cindy's absolutely right that we had, as you know, a historic turnout in percentage basis and actual numbers. Tens of millions of Americans more voted than previously. Now, partly that was because states reacted on the fly to COVID by making it much easier to vote. And that's exactly, as Cindy's pointed out, what's a number of Republican legislatures are now trying to roll back. They didn't like all those people voting, and they want to make it harder, particularly harder to vote by mail. So I think 2020 runs the risk without something like HR1 and national standards of being the high watermark, that it'll be harder to vote and we'll have smaller percentages voting in future elections. What would clearly have been different had HR1 been in effect is those states like Texas that still in the middle of COVID did not allow people to have mail-in balloting in general, unless you were over 65 or were out of the state. You had to go in person and stand in line. And if HR1 was in effect, the citizens of Texas would have been safer. They would have had the opportunity to vote at home. They would not have had to go to crowded polling places and stand in line. And it would have been easier. So conceivably, never mind COVID, more people would have found ways to vote. And so I think that's an example of why having a national base of voting rights here is important.
And of course, they wouldn't have been voting in gerrymandered districts, and they would know who was paying for the digital campaign ads that they were being bombarded with, which would be a big improvement.
Great point.
So lest there has been any doubt, for the previous hour and 27 minutes, you just received definitive proof as to why I'm just a moderator and these three brilliant people are panelists, because I wouldn't have had a clue how to answer that question. Cindy, Mark, and Trevor, you're going to receive the appropriate thanks that you deserve from our hosts in just a minute, but I'll jump the gun on them by thanking you not only for being with us tonight, but for the extraordinary work that you do all day and every day on behalf of our democracy. I know I speak for all of our participants and our audience members to let you know how grateful we are to all of you for what you do and for saving me on that last question. Gabe, Amari, Sarah, Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share one last screen for everybody. Okay, so should be all set. So like Dan said, first and foremost, I really want to wholeheartedly thank our moderator. So Dan, I got to thank you and our panelists, Cindy, Trevor, and Mark. All of you are volunteering your time with us on a Friday evening, and we really appreciate your efforts to move our democracy forward, all of you. The work you do is inspiring. The knowledge that you possess is amazing. And I've been awestruck listening to you share your commitment to democracy. You're all working towards a more perfect union, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. In addition to what you've heard this evening, please look up our respective organizations at the locations shown. Represent San Diego and Bay Area will be working hard on local corruption reform, and Represent Us National will be providing additional ways that you can help get the For the People Act to become law. Like I mentioned earlier, phone banks, text banks, we'll be doing all kinds of social media blitzes. They're having meme parties, all kinds of stuff. You name it and we can get it for you. Policy Nerd Nights will be continuing to do a lot of work, and I really got to say that they're doing a great job, and I'm really, really happy to have been here hosting with them, and I will let them say something in a second. But I really want to thank the team that's helped to create this event. I look forward to working with Policy Nerd Nights crew again. You guys helped to initiate the plan. You helped to host and get everything set up. Sarah, Jess, Sean, thank you guys so much. Represent us Bay Area. Thank you to Rosalind for helping to initiate also. Amari for helping to plan, host, handle moderation and the webinar. I mean, the San Diego crew, Amy, Dan, Juliet, Dan, Diane, Gil, you guys, lots of prep, lots of social media blitzes, lots of spreading the word. So thank you so much. We even had help from Arizona, Wisconsin, Texas, Oregon, Washington. I mean, this is really a combined effort. We all believe in this effort, and we're here to try to make it happen. So, yeah, I mean, thank you for everybody, and also RepresentUS National, Kaya, Ben, James, logistics support, webinar support, all that stuff has been fantastic. And with that, I will just say personal thank you and pass it over to Sarah.
All right, thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you so much, RepresentUS. And most importantly, huge, immeasurable amount of gratitude for our panelists and our moderator. Needless to say, you made this night so incredibly enjoyable and impactful. And to everybody who's listening and watching tonight, first of all, thank you for spending your time with us. And second of all, let's turn this last hour and a half into action. I'm sure you're pumped. I'm pumped. So let's text bank and let's phone bank with RepresentUS, all the chapters across the nation. And if these types of educational webinars are interesting and impactful to you, please get in touch with Policy Nerd Nights. If you want to be an attendee, if you want to be an organizer, if you have suggestions for future panels, this is a grassroots, people-powered organization, y'all. So get in touch with us, follow us on social media, email us, whatever you prefer, and we'll get back in touch with you. Again, thank you a million.
And I will go ahead and close and say thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone that showed up this evening on Zoom. Thank you to all of our panelists, and special shout out to Dan Schnur. You were absolutely sensational. Next for RepresentUS nationally is a banner drop. So if anyone that is listening is looking for action, something that is tangible that they can do now, please visit RepresentUS. Or if you want to go to the RSVP page, you can email me personally and I will connect you to your certain city's banner drop location and for more information. This was wonderful and amazing, and I'm so appreciative. Thank you all. And with that,
all right, thank you so much again, everyone. Have a fantastic rest of your evening. Thank you for spending your Friday evening with us. To the panelists, to the attendees, to everybody.
Thank you.
bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
What's our plan? I know. Next Zoom. I didn't get the this and message you.
Sounds good. Thank you again, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.